that Dr. Hyder has agreed to give us a talk on something as important as institutional capacity development for research ethics systems in developing countries. Adnan came up to me just as I was getting my salad and said, I'm just working my way through this. I'm not sure. And it's like, yeah, right. I don't know. For those of you who don't know Adnan, he's probably the most organized and systematic thinker I know. And I have a feeling this is going to be a much more developed presentation than you, Adnan, think that it's going to be. It always is coming from you. I'm going to read just a couple of lines just to make sure I get the affiliations correct. Adnan, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Hyder is in the Department of International Health, where he is an associate professor here at the Bloomberg School, and where he directs the International Injury Research Unit. Is that the right term for it? He's also core faculty of the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy, which is also part of the Bloomberg School. And at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, we are delighted to say that recently he took on yet another responsibility as Associate Director for Global Programs. So if anybody needs a director or an associate director or something like that, and they're looking for someone to fill, Adnan's done, right? His dance card is completed, although he probably could take on 6 or 7 more such responsibilities in a way that no one else could. Also, with Nancy Cass at the Berman Institute and here at the Bloomberg School also, he co-directs the NIH Fogarty International Research Ethics Training Program, which is an absolutely extraordinarily successful and wonderful program that allows for people in developing leadership positions in Africa to develop expertise in research ethics by visiting with us and then by continuing to be mentored by Nancy and Adnan and Joe Ali and others once they return to their countries. I don't know exactly how much of this to read, so I'm going to do this quickly. In addition to running just about everything that I can think of, Dr. Hyder serves as a consultant to the Global Forum for Health Research of the World Health Organization in Geneva and is a consultant to many other international organizations. He's published and worked for quite a number of years on health systems development, equity, and public health ethics, which is the capacity in which he's going to be speaking with us today. He could just as equally be giving an authoritative presentation on injury prevention in the developing world and several other key topics. But today he is wearing his global health ethics hat as he speaks with us. Much of his work has been done in South Asia and in Africa, and I suspect some of that work will inform the presentation today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hyder to
Thank you very much, Dr. Payton. It's a great pleasure, first of all, to be here and get this opportunity to talk to particularly the Bioethics Institute. I'm often asked why I persist on doing this bioethics stuff, as some of my colleagues tell me. And I suppose there are 2 fantastic reasons. One is that I'm passionate about this. So, when you are passionate about something, you just can't let it die. And the second one is, of course, the tremendous colleagues that I have at the Bioethics Institute. Probably some of the wisest people that I've come across in this institution. So it's not only the fact that they are wise, but they're also very warm. And so it feels like a home when you go to the Bioethics Institute, and particularly now at the new Deering Hall, which is an amazing building, thanks to the generosity of our donors. So it's always a pleasure to be with my colleagues there. And today I hope to share with you a little bit about some of my thinking, and again, when I say my thinking, I mean really the group work that I've been involved with in thinking about how a systems perspective could be brought to the topic of research ethics in particular, with a very, very strong focus on low and middle income countries, or what I might refer to in this presentation as developing countries. You'll also be interesting for you to see that throughout this talk, particularly in the subtitle slides, I will be giving you injury prevention messages. So it's for you to figure out from those photographs and those subtitles what injury prevention message I'm giving you. And I have to do that because I'm an injury prevention professional for some part of my life. So I feel that I must convey that, but in a very subtle way. So what I want to do for the next 40 minutes or so is really briefly review some of the rationale and reasons why I got interested in this work from the time that I started working with colleagues at the World Health Organization looking at health research systems, moving over to the conceptualization that we did of research ethics systems, begin to talk a little bit about the role of the institution in this system, and then about half of my talk will discuss ways on understanding this better and how do you measure the institutional dimension of these systems. I will share with you some of our current work, which I am doing with colleagues like Professor Nancy Cass, Joe Ali, and other students, such as Tara and Carly and others in our group. And indeed, the idea for presenting that today is to open that up and receive constructive feedback from all of you here. This is work in progress. We recognize that, and all helpful suggestions will be very, very useful for us as we move forward. Okay, so remember the injury prevention subtle messages that starts from this subtitle. Okay, what I want to do first is I'd like to review, so that all of us are speaking the same language, work that's about 10 years old, in which I, myself, together with a group of 3 to 4 colleagues, started working on this notion of health research systems. This culminated in 2004 in a special summit in Mexico called Knowledge for Better Health, and a WHO publication, and so on, and I would be happy to provide references at the end of the talk, both now or via email. The intent of that work was really to try and figure out and conceptualize what could be considered a research system at country level. So this is how we began to think about this, and I'm going to throw many frameworks in this presentation, and in order to deliver that framework, I'm going to use figures. Now, schematic illustrations of frameworks are useful because they help in understanding things, but at the same time, they have their intrinsic limitations. So feel free to understand both the strength of what I'm trying to convey in these figures, but also recognizing that the schematic illustration is simply that. It's an illustration of a concept. So we began by studying and recognizing that every country has a national health system, and that operates no matter how well or unwell you think it's doing, it exists. And this is true for the developing world as well. We also recognize that no matter how embryonic it might be, there is a research system. There are science and technology institutions operating, even in low-income countries. There is agricultural research going on. There's many different types of research production that is going on. And obviously, some of that research occurs in the health sector and may overlap with the health system. We also wanted to acknowledge that while these subsystems exist, in fact, they operate within a larger national system in which many other sectors are operating. The private sector, the industrial sector, technology sector, civil society, the environmental sector, and so on. So to recognize the context within which the health and the research system are operating. We also wanted to recognize the fact that within this context are not just these other sectors, but rules and laws and regulations and legislation that govern the operations of these. They range from all the way from the constitution of a particular country right down to the operational rules for private sector to operate or for a research organization to operate. And so looking at this context, we figured out then, how does one define then a national health research system? And we posited that in fact the health research system exists somewhere at the confluence of these contextual factors. Certainly it involves the health sector. Indeed, it involves part of the research system, but it involves more. It does involve the non-governmental organizational sector. It does involve the rules and regulations governing a particular country. So it is not subsumed within any one of these circles, but largely contextualized as something that overlaps many of these important issues. And so we defined a health research system as the people, institutions, and activities whose primary purpose is the generation of high-quality knowledge. Now remember, there is already a health system whose primary purpose is improve the health of populations. That's separate. We're talking about the research system. And that production of knowledge is not passive. that production of knowledge has important consequential value. That is, it is used to promote, restore, or maintain the health status of the population. That's why it's a health research system, not an agricultural research system or a science and technology research system. And some of us on the committee were very, very emphatic that the mechanisms that are used to incorporate this knowledge into policies, into programs, into operational guidelines at country level should be part of this definition. In other words, simply the production of knowledge is not enough. Its utilization and those factors that enable that utilization must be part of this construct. So with this definition, we started work in exploring that if this particular health research system exists, what could be the potential functions and goals of such a health research system? And again, today I'm not going to go into tremendous detail about this, but share with you that we identified 4 overarching functions of a health research system. We identified the production and use of knowledge as a very important function. We identified the financing of this system as an important function. We identified the creation and sustaining of resources. This means not just financial resources, these are the technical resources. These are very importantly the human resources that go in sustaining such a system. And then we identified stewardship. For those of you who follow the health systems literature, you know after 2000, when the WHO's health systems frameworks came out, this word stewardship was being looked at very, very carefully. What it means, what it entails, but this notion that there is the function of looking after the health research system. And so we premised that indeed these 4 large functions, and again, for those of you interested in details, there are many, many sub-functions under these boxes that we can talk about later on, that if these 4 functions were actually implemented, then indeed the health research system would contribute to 2 very large goals: the advancement of knowledge and the achievement of health, but also health equity. In other words, not just absolute levels of health, but also improvement in health differentials across populations. This is a lot of thinking. It took about 3 or 4 years, and it culminated, as I mentioned, in 2004, not only with some peer-reviewed publications, but also a WHO report called Knowledge for Better Health. I wanted to now focus that, in fact, ethics was put under the stewardship function. We had very interesting discussions, and I'm sure many of you, just from the names and titles on the screen here, could say, well, why not here, and why not there? And we can sort of discuss that. But the end result of our discussions was that part of good stewardship was looking after the ethics of a health research system. And that's where my interest particularly arose at that time. So I wanted to use these initial few minutes to provide to you this overall landscape of a national health research system. And I am now going to zoom in a little bit on the ethics function related to a national health research system. So that sort of ended the work that we did between 2000 and 2004. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more and a little bit more in depth about our effort then to begin to think about systems for research ethics. How can we build and bring the health systems lens to the topic that many of us are particularly interested in? So 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of the international dialogue around research ethics, and there was considerable post-1997, was around guidelines, particularly national and international guidelines for research ethics, conversations around research ethics review. There were papers on standards of care, and indeed, a lot of conversation in which some of us were participating on capacity building. And the question that some of us started asking were that these are very important issues, but are they truly sufficient to address this systems approach towards research ethics? What are the other components of health systems or research systems that might be important for research ethics to consider? In fact, when we looked at many of the guidelines, whether they were COMS guidelines or TDR guidelines, most of them were not explicitly considering some of these systemic dimensions. And one in particular of my interest was the institutional dimension. I do recognize that more recent guidelines, such as the one for IRB or research ethics committees, does address institutions in some way. But certainly beyond that, many of the guidelines were very much focused towards the individual and the individual researcher, and not talking about the institution or the group of institutions that might be operating together. So this troubled us in general, and we started thinking about, well, how can we construct a more systemic thinking, a more systems view, as we called it, of research ethics? What would be the components of such a system? And if we define these components, how would they be interacting to produce this research ethics system? And more particularly, my interest was also on looking at, within the system, what are the institutional arrangements and responsibilities? And when I say institutions, I mean research organizations, I mean universities, I mean academic centers, I mean NGOs if they are conducting human subjects research. So that entire spectrum. A lot of the conversation in these institutions at that time, again, this is just 5 years ago, was focused on IRBs, on research ethics committees. We don't have one, we need one. We have one, it's not working, how can we do a better job, etc. And then, of course, linking back to our global vision. If we were to define a system, if we were to define elements of this and figure out how they interact, how would this weave back into a coherent conceptual framework of research ethics system? So that's the most of my talk henceforth is going to be focused around those conceptual issues. So we started thinking of what are the components. Obviously, investigators play a critical role in research ethics and have to be considered for any systemic view. And what influences an investigator's conduct? Well, I'm sure each one of you could come up with a variety of lists, and I have some examples here. Everything from personal goals and ambitions, to the opportunities that are provided, to the kind of conduct that is displayed in terms of the respect for rules, respect for research ethics review processes, influences by peers and by leadership. Particularly, younger researchers are heavily influenced by what they see around them. And indeed, the type of conversation that is going around in the institutions within which they work. I'm sure you could give me another 6 possible influences on investigators' conduct. The point is that there are multiple pathways where individual investigators can be influenced in terms of their conduct. And again, the lens we are looking at this conduct is a research ethics lens. We recognize this and said this is an important element of any systems approach. So that's the first one we thought about. The second one, and again gleaming from the literature, was obviously the research ethics review process. This review process institutionalized in some way as IRBs or RECs or ERCs, depending upon which part of the world you're in, looking at, well, what's the independence of this review? What sort of scrutiny is given to the protocols? How do the investigators play that role? What types of authority is given to these IRBs in terms of exercising this influence? How do they monitor and conduct research? And very importantly, what augmentation do they have to provide corrective action? And how do they do that? Many, many issues which have been raised in the literature, but all very important under this second element, or what we thought is important to bring together in our systems approach, is this research ethics review process. But we wanted to go beyond the individual and the IRB. So the next thing that we started to look at is the institution. And we said, what about the institutional commitment? What is the commitment of, let's say, a university to human subject research protection? What does it do to promote ethical conduct? About establishing appropriate institutional priorities around research, or structures to enhance that, or processes and procedures to implement that. And very importantly, how does that conform with those around them, within the context in which these institutions operate? So we believe that this third important element of any systemic approach was the institution, and we need to study that as part of our systems approach. But we also recognized, and you saw that we are learning a little bit from the health research framework, that institutions operate within a context of that country, of that region. And so we needed to look at the influences upon the institution. And the influences upon the institution therefore come from national laws, national guidelines, national authorities, memberships in other groups where other institutions might be, and very importantly, as all of us know, budgetary priorities. Particularly for public sector institutions in the developing world, the budgetary priority is a very important leverage of what the institution does and how it prioritizes its actions. And of course, very importantly, how investments at the country level, what types of researchers are being generated, what types of research is being promoted, what types of training programs are being supported would be important. So that was our fourth element that we wanted to consider in terms of our research ethics systems. The more we thought about country, the more we recognized that countries differ in socioeconomic development, in all types of different status. And so we attempted to define this fifth component, and we've called it enabling conditions. In other words, it's just not enough to talk about the rules and regulations, but certainly it's also important to talk about what else is happening in that country. What are the values that are expressed in different types of life domains? Does the country have a strong civil society? Are there cohorts of trained people, just scientists and researchers in the country? What sort of public accountability frameworks are in place? Very importantly, what sort of trust exists in society? And there are now subsequent papers, not in the research ethics domain, but in health systems, that are now trying to measure the impact of just basic trust in transactional processes and how it affects interactions in healthcare. And how does that translate to transactions in research ethics? This is reaching a little beyond even thinking about the country. But if you think about certain countries, and again, when I mention countries as examples, please understand, I'm obviously using them to illustrate. If you think about Zimbabwe, you have a particular regime. Think about Libya past 48 hours. Think about regimes where you can talk about institutions operating, but the enabling conditions, whether they are there or not, for these research ethics systems to operate. So that was our fifth level, complex level, but we wanted to identify this. And then finally, since we were thinking, and when academics think, they tend to keep thinking, we went really macro, right? And we built on people who've done a lot more thinking than us around this, and started thinking about this whole notion of what are the opportunities available to people and how that might affect our research ethics systems in the political sphere, the economic sphere, and building on the work of people like Amartya Sen, thinking about these 5 freedoms, as he had called it, and thinking a little bit in terms of the vision of how does one link those types of freedoms to the research ethics system. And so I've tried many different types of schematic illustrations to try and capture this schema, but I'm going to try a new one right now, which is to look at the fact that this proposed framework, therefore, is really one where investigators' conduct, something that we and the literature has talked about for many, many years in research ethics, now is positioned within this nexus. And the nexus is around not only the research ethics review process, or the IRB, but also the institutional commitment and framed within national policies. And we recognize that, in fact, this can be affected by the enabling conditions, the conditions that will promote and support this. And finally and ultimately, thinking very macro in terms of those factors that we call development factors. This took us about 3 to 4 years to figure out. And you might call us slow, or you might call us detail-oriented. But working with colleagues like Jim Lavery, like Liza Dawson and others, we spent many years thinking through this. And particularly, I was involved in a project on health systems research analysis at WHO that was doing similar thinking for health systems. So I was able to maintain a parallel process in thinking about research ethics systems. I am not sure that this is the definitive framework anymore. I think there needs to be some more thinking on this, but it's a start, and I would welcome some input into if you think particularly there are missing elements in research ethics systems. But it's a good start to begin to understand the fact that an individual researcher's conduct is not just controlled by him or her alone, but by a spectrum of influences. Some of them are very macro indeed. And also to recognize the reverse flow, which is that countries and institutions can create environments that are very supportive of research ethics done the right way. And that interaction is what we wanted to demonstrate with the help of this framework. We think that this framework, therefore, addresses 3 of the fundamental issues, as we call them. One, is to go beyond the discourse of individuals and IRBs. Really, we want to move beyond that. Secondly, to bring and highlight the role of institutions and the importance that institutional responsibility has. And finally, to recognize that institutions work within a context. And there are so many things, such as relevance of research, such as relevance of investments, that has to be judged from the framework of not just one institution within a country, but of a national context, and therefore is a larger decision. Okay, so that brought us to somewhere around 2009 and allowed us to begin to think a little bit more about these systemic issues. What I want to present now is moving forward together with my colleagues in the Fogarty Africa Bioethics Training Program and trying to figure out how do we study this research ethics system. And I hope to share with you some very preliminary results as well from a case study. So back to our framework. You understood, I'm hoping, at least in some way, this framework. And as you know, many investigators, and some of you are in the room, have looked at investigators' conduct through surveying researchers, for example, both quantitative surveys as well as qualitative explorations, and we have done some of that work. But in general, what had been somewhat missing was this institutional commitment issue. How do you explore this particular domain? And that is the focus of the next 15, 20 minutes of conversation. Now, that means that institutions have to begin thinking about research ethics in a different way. The current way is simply, oh, must make sure investigators do ethical research, must have IRB. And the other way is to begin to think about, wait a minute, what is the function behind research ethics system? What is the goal? What is our vision? And so both structural and process changes might be required. What I mean by structural change would be within institutions is exactly that new structures might be created, new positions might be created that are responsible for something. Maybe if it's not a completely new structure, existing structures are used and reformulated. But not just structures and positions, but also processes for considering the important issues around research ethics and procedures established to make sure that they are continuously considered, not on a one-time basis or an ad hoc basis. For those of you who are better experts on organizational change than me, there are many, many references in the management literature on this. I have put down a couple here that I think have some relevance to the research ethics system, and again would be happy to talk a little bit more about this later on. But as I read through many of these references, and you look at the experiences of institutions, as particularly with respect to health systems changes, there are some interesting features. The first one is that there has to be some acceptance of the need for change, right? And so a decision has to be taken at the level of the institution. Then you have to have support right from the top, all across the board. And there are variations in the literature about what types of support and which time different types of support is needed. But support is important across the institutions. Those changes or those actions or those procedures have then to be integrated or created. People have to recognize that they are of value, and that's very important. Otherwise, the support diminishes. Sustainability mechanisms have to be thought of. You can establish a new IRB, you don't fund it, you don't give it an office. How will it function, for example? A classic example we are already facing in many parts of Africa. And then very importantly, it's not enough to do this once, but it's also important to do quality improvement over time and to monitor that change and to keep asking ourselves the question, is my institution still addressing this particular issue? The 6 steps or stages or phases that I've written here are generic language translated from the various themes and frameworks that some of you might be more familiar with. I'm using simply this to illustrate that it is more than simply say the change should happen and the change happens. Obviously, there's a whole process behind it. So the idea for us is, now how do we study this? And so our goal was really to operationalize the concept of research ethics systems with a particular focus on understanding how these systems, particularly in developing countries, can help promote, review, and monitor research ethics. It's a big goal. We aren't there yet. We are still pursuing it. And for the first part of our work, which started about a year and a half ago, our specific aims were to explore the methods, understand these methods, because without that, how do we measure? How do we account for structural changes and functional changes? How are we going to capture that? And then indeed to apply these methods in a few case studies, to pilot test them in some way. We do have another aim, which we haven't sort of gotten to as yet, and I won't talk about, which is this whole association between the systems and development factors, right? We will do that when we've covered a number of different countries or institutions, and then we can play with that one. So I won't talk about that particular, but I would like to talk a little bit about the first two. So we started looking at methods, and we said, well, let's pick up a model that we can use and apply this to research ethics systems, and I'm sure to no surprise to some of you, we couldn't find an existing model to apply. Particularly, again, remember, my individual interest in the work of our group was focused on low and middle income countries. So we wanted a broad spectrum, as I've called it, model that was cognizant of the changing realities of institutions, but yet was decent enough to give us a model to work with. And we found one with the Swedish International Development Organization has used, called the Octagon model. And you'll see in a minute why that is so user-friendly. Interestingly enough, it had been used in Africa, which is where we were working in right now, and it had been used for NGOs. In other words, the types of organizations that we thought we would be working with over the next couple of years. The Octagon model has 4 categories, which really are each divided into 2, so in a sense, octagon or 8 different domains on which to rate institutions. Very quickly, and again, I'd be happy to look at that. The first category is really based on what is called institutional identity. How does the institution identify itself? What are its values? What are its structure and organization? And we, remember, are going to take these definitions and apply them to research ethics. So it's not the overall institutional value, but really, what are they doing for research ethics? The second category is outputs or activities. Again, the implementation, but also their relevance to the local and national context, and evaluating that at the level of the institution. The third, the capacity to do this type of work. Are the right skills present in the individuals? Are the right systems for financing and administration present? And the fourth and final one, what is called relations and context, in which they are separating target groups that are who are the collaborators or stakeholders that the institution is working internally and externally, and then the working environment within which the institution is working. So these 4 categories allowed us to think about research ethics systems under those domains, and what we thought was a very good mechanism of looking at these 8 domains as we study these institutions in Africa. Well, the domains are interesting, but how do we actually evaluate those domains? And that came back to our work in empirical ethics. And we said, well, what are the methods that we could use to collect data from these institutions? And as some of you will expect, we attempted to use mixed methods approach. And right now, I will talk about 5 different methods that we've used in order to collect this level of data. I'm going to spend a minute on each one of them so you have some sense of what entails. I will not go into the details, but again would be very happy to talk to you later. The first one, of course, is review of documents. Now, it's very important to understand we are looking at institutional policies and procedures. By the way, if somebody says, yeah, it does exist, but I can't show it to you in writing, it means it doesn't exist. Okay? So it couldn't be a document that people thought existed. It had to be something that we could see. Right? And examples are, of course, a university-wide or an institution-wide science policy or ethics policy or research policy, strategic plan, etc. Things that are important. The second thing that we did is that we built what we called an institutional survey. This again took lots of lessons from the work that I was doing with health research systems analysis for WHO. Here, the respondent is the institution, and the leadership substitutes for the respondents here. They are responding on behalf of the institution, not as individuals. And we requested the institutional leadership to respond. We also are not withholding them from having discussions and consultations and so on before they respond. That's fine, as long as we get that survey. And we have 4 modules in it. One that asks them about the context within which they are operating, one that asks them about their institutional policies, about their research activities, and then a specific module on IRBs. And here's an example of the type of questions that we will ask about. Do you have written policies on research protocols, for example? Do you provide financial support to different offices? Do you offer educational opportunities, etc.? And again, it's a pretty extensive survey form which Joe and Nancy and others have helped craft into a much more manageable form. The third method of data collecting was IRB surveys. We did a 43-question quick survey with tick mark responses for IRB members, asking them about their experiences under the assumption that this group has a particular interest in research ethics. So it forms a special category of people. We also do in-depth interviews, key informants at the level of the institution, both leadership and others, and we try and focus a lot more about finding about the institution and the opinions that these individuals have on institutional rules. And we also do focus group discussions with different types of stakeholders, including students and teachers and researchers, to try and get a sense from them about what these stakeholders think. And again, different types of perspectives taken. For example, you want to know if individuals have actually participated in ethics training, or if they have done research, what have their experiences been, how does research ethics affect the day-to-day life of an individual faculty member, etc. The key to this data collection is that through all of these data collection methods, the questions and the are mapped on to one of the 8 elements, one of the 8 domains of the Octagon. And we analyze these by the 8 domains, and then as the evaluating team, we provide a score, which ranges from 1 to 7 in this process. It's a subjective score. It ranges from 1, which means that a lot more work needs to be done, to 7, which is a high score. And that's how you can display an Octagon, right? Very simplistic, but visually appealing. And the idea was that we can then go ahead and map this, and not only do it ourselves, by the way, but then provide the opportunity for the institution to map this as well. So we send the instructions of the Octagon to the institution, and we say, what do you think about these 8 domains? Rate yourself, right? And then, of course, we fundamentally are talking about a tool that is deliberative, that allows them to think through, and fundamentally, you don't necessarily compare 10 different institutions, but you allow the same institution to compare itself over time and improve itself. And then all the other issues around such types of deliberative tools, iterative tools that I'm sure you can already discuss. Okay, so that was the methodological approach that we took. It is, as I said, still an evolution. We'd love comments on that. But in the last 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is share with you our first case study, which we are still working on and still analyzing data. We've had some delays. And what I'd like to do is simply share this with you and as we are writing it currently. So we went to the University of Botswana in Gaborone. We spent all of 2010 with them. We reviewed many of their documents, many of their policies. We conducted this institutional survey. We gave the quick count survey to IRB members. We did stakeholder interviews. We did focus group discussions. And we were there twice during 2010. Based on that, we have now put together, and we are beginning to put together, a framework. Here's one example of the type of results that we have. So we had 18 respondents of our quick survey. You can see that, very importantly, a number of these IRB members were in fact women, more than men. You see that there's a spectrum of whom are very well trained with doctoral degrees. And indeed, this is a sample where a number of them have had some form of research ethics training. That could have been a 2-day workshop. It could have been a 2-year course. All of them were counted as some form of research ethics training. And again, as we analyze this data further, we will dig a little bit deeper into this. But let me make a few comments now about those 8 domains. Again, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail, but I'd like to share a few things with you. The University of Botswana, turns out, has an amazing plethora of policies written down. And they're all dated about 10 years ago, 2000 to 2002. Very well documented. So a lot of kudos to them. The interesting thing is that as of 2004, 2005, the university has decided to become research intensive by 2021, which means that the entire university is promoting research in all departments at all levels. And so while it has these wonderful policies, one of the questions is, do they need to be relooked at and reframed with this new research intensive element? They do not have a policy right now that all researchers have to be trained in research ethics, something that they might want to consider. They do in fact have an Office of Research, which they fund, and there's generally good coordination between this. In terms of their structures, they actually have a Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs who looks after research. They're in fact very closely looking after that, and so very strong points on that. They in fact have about 4 committees. They have a research committee, an animal use committee, a research review committee. But there is somewhat confusion and overlapping roles between these various committees and in fact the Office of Research as well. If we look at the activities in the field of research ethics, they in fact, the IRB for example has gone ahead, it's been around, they've got an FWA, they usually look at 40 to 50 proposals, many of them are local domestic proposals, but an increasing proportion now collaborative, and they have different types of reviews available. What is very clear in terms of activities is there's a huge demand for training. Many faculty members and staff members are calling for this type of training. And in fact, if you look at graduate students, research ethics is not required of them. And now they are becoming research intensive, which means all degrees will be required to do some form of research, whether it's a 3-month research project or a 12-month research project. The Office of Research is about 4 to 5 years old, but particularly active in the past 2 years when they got an amazing associate director who just happens to be one of our former alumni from the Fogarty program, Paul Ndebele. So it's been really effective for the past 2 years. They've done a lot of training, but they've had very low response rates very often in their training program. So you say, expressed need for training, but low response when the training is offered. Something to be looked at. Interestingly enough, they're moving ahead with a lot of research, including community-based public health research. But when we found out, they don't actually have faculty member trained in public health. A lot of the IRB members, while they had done these short workshops, they really wanted more training. They wanted more advanced training. Many of them were turning over their IRB membership, not for the 2 to 3 years they were supposed to, but within 6 to 9 months for various reasons. And interestingly enough, in Botswana, there's also a lot of expatriate workers coming in and out. And so you have not only a rotation out of the institution, but out of the country. And in fact, many of the faculty members we met were from different countries in Africa. It actually allocates 4.5% of its budget to the Office of Research and Development, which for an African university was amazing. 65% of that is obviously for salaries. About 1.5 full-time equivalents are funded through that, but they have a little bit of other money for small research activities and training. UB, University of Botswana, does raise money through grants. They charge a 20% IDC or indirect rates. However, the IRB, of course, is not able to raise independent money for now. It has very good relations with the ministry, by the way, and very healthy collaborations, and some of you know that University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and others are working intensively there. They are building their relationship with the United Nations systems. Very importantly, they are very concerned about minority tribes in Botswana who have been the focus of anthropological research for many years. So they have an outreach program, for example, for the San community, which has been the focus of many of these projects. In fact, at the country level, there are no rules and organizations governing, rules governing organizations like this university. There was an old law for anthropological research that was being used. There's a lot of movement right now to transplant that. There's a bill that is moving its way through Parliament, which Paul and others are playing an important role. And therefore, there was a lot of confusion, because the ministry to date wanted to review every single research proposal, even if it was for a BSc undergraduate student. And the university and the ministry have to clarify these allocations. So that presents then the case study from Botswana that we wanted to share with you. So I presented to you all the way from the thinking on health research systems to our conceptualization of research ethics systems. What are the methods by which we can explore specifically institutions, some preliminary results from Botswana. Let me end by sharing with you some final thoughts. I think that this pathway from health research systems to research ethics system is still under construction. I think there's a lot of thinking needed, and some of you have the brain power to do that. Certainly we can begin to delineate that further. But I also think, and some of you know my interest in operational approaches, that it's important to operationalize it at the same time in a way that is useful. So we need to test the framework. We need to figure out what are the methods to identify the gaps and the missing elements in this framework through collecting data. I think fundamentally it's important to understand how institutions, particularly in the developing world, can really become these good stewards, right? We don't have the answer, but that's where we are going. And you want to know this not because you want to pronounce judgment, but because you want to develop their capacity. And I think in the process of developing their capacity, we are in fact enhancing ours. Not only to understand that vision, but to bring the message back home. Because I don't think we are doing that the right way here necessarily. And we've learned that at our own institution over time. I'd like to end by simply acknowledging this is only one approach to address this issue. I'm sure many of you can come up with alternative approaches which are much more significant than the one that I presented. But I hope that we can periodically report back, and we'll look forward to hearing more comments and questions. Thank you very much. Okay, Holly.
So I have two questions, maybe you pick which one you want to answer. So the first was, as you got to the framework at the end of the first half of your talk, I was wondering if you're sort of aspiring to use it in any sort of diagnostic way. So for example, I might say, well, Libya 48 hours ago was not, it couldn't do this because of all those other factors, or not. So I guess just sort of thinking about what the utility of that is if you were thinking of it as a diagnostic. And then I really like, so we came from the top down and now from the bottom up. And I'm wondering, now that you've had the experience of going from the bottom up, what additional components would you like to be able to measure in that space that would be helpful as you move forward with this piece of the project?
Thank you, Holly. Great questions. First, let me say that, so we are at our very initial thoughts about the potential uses of the framework. I got an email from a colleague in Germany who now is saying, can I use your framework to evaluate the German research ethics system? And I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure we are there yet. I don't know what to tell you and how to do this. So I'm sharing some of my thoughts with her. But I think one of the potential uses that there is a desire in the future is indeed that diagnostic use. But again, I want to frame it very appropriately as diagnosis, not for the external agent to come in and say, this is how awful or how well you're doing, but really for the group itself in some ways with external assistance. So I think you're right. I think that would be one of the potential users. In addition to the evaluative use, to some extent that is under the framework which we are using it right now. But your second question is much more interesting, because I think the dialogue hasn't really become as warm right now because we haven't gotten back to UB. Yeah. I hope that we can do that in the next few months so that we can really sit down on the table with them. But one of the elements, which is I think implicit in this framework, but we don't have a domain for it, is trust. And the more I think about this, the more I'm thinking, well, my colleagues in health systems are trying to measure this trust. And I know it percolates through many of these domains, but there's no domain, there's no triangle, there's no horizontal element here. How do I do that? And so that would be an example of one, and I don't know, that would be a nanogram or something like that, nonagon or whatever you call it. So I'll be careful in adding domains, but yes, that would be one example of something that I think we don't measure explicitly as yet. But thank you for that. Yes, sir?
In your analysis and looking at this whole issue, you talked about interviewing investigators, and you talked about interviewing key institutional stakeholders, but I don't think I heard you talk about interviewing people who are taking part in research studies, the research subjects themselves in these countries, to see their view.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important stakeholder group. For this particular case study, we were not able to go out to the research communities, but I think that you're pointing out a very important area to document, which is what is the perceptions of the institution from the communities in which they engage in. And I think that is becoming increasingly very important. Because irrespective of what the institution thinks is the reality, the perception within the community is going to be critical. So absolutely, I agree that we need to add that to our stakeholder list. Yes?
So, all the time you're talking, I'm thinking what the web would look like if we did the US.
Yeah.
It's really an intriguing notion. I'm a little nervous about how much would be pink or purple. But I was wondering if we could go backwards a little bit. I'm also intrigued. You started with the larger frame of health research systems, from which you went to health research ethics systems. If we started with health systems, could we do this for the ethics of health systems? And how would that go? And how, what would be the connection between your health research ethics system and your health systems ethics?
So that's a $1 million question, which now in some of the work that I'm working with my colleagues in Future Health Systems, one of the larger sort of multi-country projects that we are doing, we hope over the next couple of years to begin to tease out the relationship between health systems and the what we might call the ethics component of that health systems. Now, Future Health Systems is very much about health services delivery within the context of low and middle income countries, and they're working in 6 countries. But I think that gives us an opportunity to test out some of these ideas, even if it's within the framework of health services delivery, because that is a key component of health systems. So I'd love to brainstorm more with you on that, and of course, but I have already started talking, and they're willing to invest in a graduate student and in a little bit of faculty time and so on. So I think we have their support in engaging this. So it's just very recent news. Just last week I got the word. So I've already told them that the Bioethics Institute has to be involved in anything. So we are going to get a new project soon. Right?
I was wondering if you could comment on the research to policy dimension with respect to, let's say, health services delivery. Because take, for example, HIV research and HIV programs. Maybe globally there could be a more integrated system, right, for scaling up the results of research into the delivery of services, and it seems like that would be necessary to satisfy the overarching goal of a health research system, right, as you characterized it. Are you looking at certain frameworks to measure that research to policy dimension?
So what you're asking is the brunt of probably a lot of the work that's going on right now in health systems is this whole notion of scaling up and how evidence is flowing to inform decisions, not just policies, but their implementation on the ground. So on the one hand, there's this huge spectrum of work that is ongoing where people are saying, oh, I know actually how research gets into policy, and then you say, nah, that doesn't work. Oh, then there's another model and another model. And the questions that are being raised are saying, well, is this so context specific that you can't have generalizable knowledge on how research gets into policy? Some of us feel that there are generalizable lessons that can be learned in addition to the context specific lessons. So for a good health research system to exist, particularly under the rubric of good stewardship, that doesn't end with the production of knowledge, but it has to go with the utilization of knowledge. I think at this stage we haven't gone ahead to explore that further, specifically under research ethics. We have gone to explore that further in health systems research. And we are trying to determine prospectively what are the possible pathways of influencing decision. I would say 80–85% of the work that's done in that field is retrospective analysis of decisions, tracing back to the research that has influenced them. Very little work has been done prospectively. There are now some studies out from low and middle income countries. And yes, so I think there's a huge opportunity to do that type of work. And I hope that we can do that in research ethics systems as well. Yes, please?
So this isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. I'm interested to know, and I know you haven't done this yet, but to know when you go back to the University of Botswana and they explain the difference in your rankings, I'd be interested to hear how much their decisions about that were weighed against them comparing themselves to other institutions, so sort of brother and sister institutions, because I think we have a habit of saying, well, I'm better than that person at this, and so I'm going to rank myself higher. And then also, if they explain away some of the variation going to the broader system level of the country itself, because I think that I'm thinking of sort of a system of corruption, like a very corrupted country, that where in structures of the sort that we just take for granted are not taken for granted.
Right.
They're or perhaps they're only given so much weight because they really haven't been supportive in the past for individuals and institutions. So I'd be interested to see how that dynamic plays out in terms of the ranking system within an institution, and see if that's what you start to pull apart when you see the difference between what you've ranked sort of as an outsider perspective.
Great comment, and I think that's exactly the type of dialogue that we need to have and explore that. And you're very right, it might be competitive. Just like here, we think we are number one, so we don't look up, we just look down. Remember that? Yeah, always. But yes, very important. By the way, before I end, I did want to acknowledge all of my colleagues who've sort of Nancy Cass, Joali, Tara, Kathy Han, who've been helping, Waleed Zafar. They're all contributing to this body of work. So don't want to give any misimpression that this is mine alone, but I'm happy to present for that.
I think we should end by